The noise never really stops anymore. It hums in the background of our lives. Phones buzzing, screens glowing, voices competing for attention. Somewhere between the music, the headlines, and the endless scrolling, silence has become a rare thing. There was a time when creativity meant sitting alone with your thoughts. Today, it often means surviving the pressure to always be seen, always heard, always producing something new. And for gifted Black creators in America, that pressure has never been just personal, it's historical. This story begins long before fame, before recognition, before applause. It begins in a world where sound was both an escape and a burden, where talent opened doors, but expectations waited on the other side. What happens when a creative mind grows up in a culture that never slows down? What happens when success arrives faster than healing? And what does it cost to carry a legacy before you've had the chance to understand yourself? This is not just a story about music or technology or success. It's a story about balance, about identity, about what we ask from our artists and what we forget to protect. And when the noise finally fades, what remains is a question many of us recognize far too well. Long before anyone knew the name, there was a child learning how to listen, not just to music, but to everything around him. The rhythm of conversations in the room, the sound of traffic outside, the way silence settled late at night. He grew up in an environment where stability was never guaranteed, but sound was always present. Radios stayed on, televisions talked back. Music filled spaces where words often failed. For many Black families, creativity has never been a luxury. It has been a form of survival. In his early years, music was not about fame or recognition. It was about control, about finding something he could shape in a world that rarely slowed down enough to explain itself. There was no clear blueprint, no industry connections waiting in the background. What existed instead was curiosity and a willingness to experiment. He learned by watching, by listening, by taking apart ideas and putting them back together in new ways. Mistakes weren't hidden. They were part of the process. At school, he was quiet but observant. Teachers noticed his focus, though few could fully understand where his attention traveled when lessons ended. While others chased predictable paths, he gravitated towards sound, technology, and creative expression. Not because it was easy, but because it felt honest. Money was tight. Time was limited. Like many young Black creators, he learned early that talent alone was not enough. You had to work harder, stay sharper, and accept that recognition might come late, if it came at all. Still, he kept going. His first steps into the creative world were small. Late nights, borrowed equipment, ideas recorded in makeshift spaces that offered more passion than polish. There was no audience yet, only persistence. Each experiment taught him something new, about sound, about storytelling, about himself. What set him apart was not just ability, but patience. He understood that building something meaningful took time, that success earned too quickly often came with hidden costs. So he stayed grounded, learning the mechanics behind the art, how systems worked, how technology shaped creativity, how culture influenced what people listened to and what they ignored. Like many Black creatives navigating American culture, he faced unspoken barriers, doors that seemed open but required extra proof. Opportunities that came with conditions, moments where he had to decide whether to stay authentic or adapt to expectations that were never designed with him in mind. Those years shaped him. They taught discipline, they taught restraint, and they taught him how to sit with uncertainty without letting it define him. Gradually, the work began to speak for itself. Not loudly, but clearly. People noticed the depth, the attention to detail, the way his creations carried both emotion and structure. He wasn't chasing trends. He was building a foundation. And while success had not yet arrived, something else had taken root. Purpose. He wasn't just creating to be seen. He was creating to understand, to connect, to leave something behind that reflected more than surface-level achievement. Looking back, those early years were less about struggle and more about preparation. About learning how to move through a complex world without losing oneself in the noise. The doors ahead were beginning to open, And with them came choices that would change everything. Success didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, then suddenly demanded attention. At first, it was recognition from the right people, those who understood craft, not just popularity. A mention here, an opportunity there. Then momentum began to build. The work reached wider audiences, crossing spaces that once felt inaccessible. What had started in isolation was now being discussed, shared, and measured. With visibility came validation. For a Black creative navigating American culture, that validation carried weight. It wasn't just about personal achievement. It felt symbolic, like proof that years of patience, discipline, and restraint had mattered. Opportunities multiplied. Rooms once closed now welcomed him in. The pace accelerated. Schedules filled. Expectations rose. And with each new milestone, the distance between the private self and the public image grew wider. From the outside, it looked like a dream. From the inside, it felt like constant motion. There were moments of pride, hearing the work resonate with people who saw themselves reflected in it. Moments when audiences didn't just consume the art, but connected with it. In those moments, the purpose felt clear. This was bigger than charts, numbers, or headlines. It was contribution. But success has a way of changing the air around you. The same world that once ignored him now watched closely. Every decision felt heavier. Every silence invited interpretation. The pressure to remain relevant, to keep creating, innovating, delivering became relentless. Rest started to feel like risk. For many Black artists, success doesn't come with the luxury of mistakes. There is often an unspoken expectation to represent more than oneself. To be an example, to carry history while building something new. That weight doesn't always show up in interviews or award ceremonies, but it lives quietly behind the scenes. Technology amplified everything. Feedback arrived instantly. Praise and criticism shared the same space. The line between creative expression and performance blurred. What once felt organic now had deadlines, metrics, benchmarks. Still, he pushed forward. There were nights when exhaustion sat heavy, but adrenaline kept him moving. Days when applause drowned out doubt, temporarily. And moments when he wondered whether slowing down would mean losing everything he had worked for. Success brought access, but it also demanded availability. Privacy shrank. Relationships shifted. The work never truly stopped, even when the lights went out. Yet, amid the pressure, there was gratitude. Gratitude for the journey. For the ability to create on his own terms, at least in theory. Gratitude for those who believed in the work when it was still forming. The peak wasn't defined by a single achievement, but by accumulation. Of responsibility, of expectation, of noise. And somewhere within that noise, a question began to surface, quietly at first. How long can a person sustain this pace before something gives? At the height of success, when everything looked aligned, the cost became harder to ignore. Not dramatic, not sudden, just a slow realization that momentum, unchecked, can pull even the most grounded person off balance. The spotlight was still bright, the applause still loud, but beneath it all, the silence he once knew, the silence that allowed him to listen, was fading, and that absence would soon demand to be addressed. The change didn't announce itself with chaos. It arrived quietly. At first, it felt like fatigue, the kind that sleep no longer fixed. The pace that once energized him now weighed differently. Mornings came with a sense of heaviness that had no clear source. The work was still there. The opportunities hadn't disappeared, but the connection to them felt thinner. There were signs he didn't want to name, moments when focus slipped, when inspiration felt forced instead of natural, when silence, once a place of clarity, became uncomfortable. He kept moving anyway, because slowing down felt dangerous, because stopping felt like surrender. In American culture, especially for Black creatives, endurance is often mistaken for strength. You learn early not to complain, not to appear ungrateful. Success is framed as something fragile, something that can be taken away if you show doubt. So he carried on even as the internal cost grew. Pressure began to accumulate in places no one else could see. Publicly, everything still looked intact. Privately, balance was slipping. Relationships felt strained. Conversations shortened. The joy that once lived inside the process now appeared only in brief flashes. The hardest part wasn't failure. It was confusion. Why did achievement no longer feel grounding? Why did progress feel hollow? There were attempts to regain control, pushing harder, working longer, filling every quiet moment with activity. But momentum, when driven by fear, has a way of deepening the problem it tries to solve. At some point, the body begins to speak when the mind refuses to listen. Restlessness turned into exhaustion. Reflection turned into rumination. The same awareness that once sharpened his creativity now amplified self-doubt. This wasn't collapse. It was erosion. The realization came slowly. Success had outpaced healing. Growth had moved faster than understanding. The world had celebrated the output, but no one had asked about the cost. In moments of solitude, questions surfaced. Not dramatic, but persistent. Who was he without the work? Without the schedule? Without the expectation to perform? These were not questions he had prepared for during the climb. There was grief in this phase, not for lost fame but for lost simplicity. For the early days when creation felt like exploration instead of obligation. For the silence that once offered refuge. And yet, within the struggle, something else emerged: honesty. For the first time in a long while, he began to acknowledge limits. Not as weakness, but as reality. He recognized that survival in a demanding system often requires adaptation, not denial. This chapter was not about falling from grace. It was about confronting the truth beneath success. The noise had grown too loud to ignore, and the only way forward was to listen again, even if what he heard was uncomfortable. The pause that followed wasn't visible to the world, but it changed everything. In the United States, stories like this are often framed as individual journeys. Talent rises, success follows, struggle becomes a footnote. But for many Americans, especially those who have lived long enough to recognize patterns, this story feels familiar for a different reason. It reflects a system that celebrates output more than well-being. A culture that rewards constant motion while quietly discouraging pause. In creative industries, success is frequently treated as proof that everything is fine, even when the cost remains invisible. For Black creators in America, that tension is magnified. Their achievements are often held up as symbols of progress, while the personal weight they carry goes largely unspoken. There is pride in representation, but also pressure to be resilient, grateful, and endlessly productive. As this story reached beyond American borders, audiences elsewhere recognized the same struggle. In Europe, in parts of Africa, in communities shaped by colonial histories and modern capitalism, the questions echoed. What does success demand? Who pays the price? And how often do we mistake endurance for health? International perspectives often strip away the myth that this is a uniquely American problem. The pace may differ, but the pattern remains. Creative minds push to their limits. Identities shaped by expectations. Silence filled with noise instead of rest. What stood out to many observers was not failure, but humanity. The realization that even those who appear successful are not immune to exhaustion. That creativity, when disconnected from care, can become unsustainable. In conversations sparked by this story, themes of mental health, balance, and legacy surfaced again and again. Older audiences, in particular, responded with recognition. They had seen this cycle before in music, in business, in their own families. The world didn't just watch, it reflected. And in that reflection, the story became less about one individual and more about a shared responsibility. To ask better questions, to value longevity over speed, to remember that behind every achievement is a human being trying to remain whole. In the end, legacy is not defined by how loud the noise was, but by what remains when it fades. Long after the schedules slow down and the headlines move on, what stays behind is influence, the quiet kind, the ideas that shaped others, the courage to create honestly in a world that often demands performance over truth, the reminder that success, when measured only by output, leaves too much unseen. This story does not end with a trophy or a final performance. It ends with understanding, with the recognition that a creative life is not a straight line, but a series of choices, some celebrated, some invisible. Choices about pace, about boundaries, about whether to listen to the body and the mind before they are forced to speak. For many who have watched this journey unfold, especially those who have lived long enough to carry their own scars of work, family, and responsibility, the lesson feels familiar. You can give your best years to building something meaningful and still need permission to rest. You can love what you do and still need space to protect who you are. The legacy here is not perfection. It is honesty, an example of what happens when creativity is treated not just as a product, but as a human process. A reminder that care is not the opposite of ambition. It is what allows ambition to last. If the story brought to mind someone you've known, an artist, a family member, or even yourself, you're not alone. These stories live quietly in many homes, carried by people who learned to keep going without being asked how they were holding up. Take a moment. Share your thoughts below if you feel moved to. We read every comment. And if you choose to stay, there are more stories like this, not about fame, but about the people behind it. Because when the noise fades, what matters most is not how much was produced, but how much of ourselves we managed to keep.